Castellano and the 4 other men, fingered by the feds as godfathers of New York's 5 crime families, all indicted today. Castellano left the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan tonight.
Christmas 1985, Big Paulie Castellano steps out of his limo driven by his driver Thomas Bilotti, and bam, 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 the rest is history, as we know.
Big Paulie Castellano's spectacular execution was a grisly piece of street theater.
John Gotti's crew took him out, and Gotti became boss of the Gambinos. But did you know that really, in the end, it was all about heroin?
Narcotics is just so lucrative that most people can't afford to stop that are involved. It's just a very profitable operation until you're caught.
And all the way up through the 80s, it was still what was making the wheels spin. The reason John Gotti had to bump off Paul Castellano was because his brother Gene and his childhood friend and right-hand man Anthony Ruggiero Jr. they were under indictment.
I'm Roger Grimsby. Here now the news. The FBI says it's slowly strangling the drug trade of the biggest organized crime family in this country, with the arrest of 8 men in Brooklyn today. The feds say they shut down much of the Gambino family's narcotics business. Mark Haynes tells us how big it was.
According to the FBI, the heroin ring was operating on a huge scale. Among the 8 arrested today, Angelo Ruggiero, allegedly the mastermind of the heroin ring. John Gotti, Ruggiero's right-hand man. John Carneglia, another major figure in the ring. The FBI gathered most of its evidence against the ring by 2 methods. First, they had an informant who penetrated the ring. And second, they planted bugs in this house in Cedarhurst. On May 17, 1982, Angelo Ruggiero met with some people at this house and then met with Confederate John Gotti. The FBI wiretap log shows Gotti asked Ruggiero, "You sure those people weren't wired up?" Ruggiero replied, "They were wired up, they gonna get their heads cut off." In fact, there were wires, there was electronic surveillance, but Ruggiero and his cronies suspected the wrong people.
I'm gonna tell you, bro, if you two never bother with me again the rest of my life, I ain't giving up paper. I can't. I can't. The good friend of mine on them tape. Well, he's the boy to have to do it her.
Hindi apa sa TV before you don't understand because of
And also mean that the bar is a bar. Understand?
Paul Castellano was pressing for the transcripts of the wiretaps. Ruggiero's house, the guy called Quack Quack we see right here, he didn't want to give him up, and Ruggiero was getting demoted. John Gotti would have got demoted if Neil Della Croce didn't protect him, and John Gotti knew probably that due to the edict against heroin dealing, which of course was, sometimes enforced and sometimes not, but in the case of the Gambino family and Paul Castellano, they were making so much money both legally. Paul Castellano was a millionaire many times over from his various legal businesses, like beef. He had a cattle beef business that was huge, that's still around. And their loan sharking, all their other regular stuff, their hooks into the construction business in New York, which was probably the most lucrative thing. Gotti was on the verge of getting demoted from a capo, and who knows, his childhood friend Quack Quack and his brother Gene might have got bumped off.
Ability of the mob to kill people in cold blood and get away with it gives them the ability to terrorize other people.
So that was the case from 1983, where Gene and Anthony Ruggiero got indicted. Now, that was connected to, so basically you've heard of the French Connection. It's 50s, 60s, into the early 70s. And there was a brief period of time in which black and other heroin kingpins, the early to mid 70s, kind of had a window of opportunity due to people like Ike Atkinson sending stuff over from Thailand, and they had Henry Marzette in Detroit, and people like Frank Matthews, etc. But really by the late 70s, especially when Carmine Galante got out of prison, the Mafia had its hooks back into things.
But according to a federal grand jury indictment, the Gambinos aren't only involved in the restaurant business, they're also allegedly involved in heroin smuggling. In fact, many authorities believe the Sicilian connection began where the famous old French connection left off. Some of the same people, including the top chemist of the French connection, are now believed to be involved in the Sicilian operation. But officials say the Sicilian connection is much bigger.
And as you hear mentioned in this news clip, there's a informant that worked at Italia, the Italian Airlines, where when Carmine Galante had his thing going on, Air Italia there was a bag of luggage coming in every single day from Italy that had H in it.
Then shortly thereafter, they were able to get an informant to infiltrate the alleged Gambino gang. The informant in the case, it turns out, is a cargo employee for Alitalia Airlines and a Sicilian native. He reportedly tape-recorded the Gambinos secretly. Federal drug authorities reportedly first got wind of the Sicilian connection and its dimensions when agents seized 2 shipments of heroin at Kennedy International Airport in August of 1979. Both had come from Italy.
And the H came from Afghanistan, Pakistan.
Long-time organized crime figures in Sicily get opium supplies from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, and then refine it in labs located in Italy and Sicily. From there it travels into New York, in everything from cars and furniture to olive oil tins.
Was turned into H in Sicily and flew out in Air Italia, and that's when Carmine Galante was at his peak and had his power.
Masked men walked into Joe and Mary's luncheonette in Brooklyn today and gunned down Carmine Galante, a man believed to be the most powerful mafia chieftain in the country. James Walker has more.
The shooting took place inside this Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. Witnesses said it was a gangland-style killing. 4 heavily armed men wearing ski masks opened fire with automatic weapons. In addition to murdering Galante and his associate Nino Coppola, the killers also murdered the restaurant's owner and wounded his 17-year-old son. One local store owner said he heard the shooting, then saw the gunman get into a burgundy-colored Dodge and race off. The store owner asked not to be identified. In public, the 70-year-old Galante was the quiet operator of a dry cleaning store in Manhattan. But to police, he was the Mafia's boss of bosses, the dominant figure in organized crime. Galante had served 12 years in jail on narcotics and loan sharking charges. Federal authorities said a contract had been taken out on his life even while he was in prison. Police must now determine not just who killed Carmine Galante, but why, whether or not his murder was an isolated incident or signals the start of a gang war.
So Galante is bumped off in 79, but the H business, of course, doesn't stop. The pizza connection is going on, where pizza parlors in New Jersey, but also in odd kind of middle of nowhere places in rural Michigan and parts of Ohio.
Law enforcement officials today announced what they call their biggest case yet in cracking a drug ring tied to organized crime and that funneled drugs from Italy through a chain of U.S. pizza parlors.
In fact, so many of the dealings in this case took place in pizza parlors that federal officials have dubbed it the Pizza Connection. To try to avoid detection, it's charged the Sicilians sent the drugs to family members who owned pizza parlors in 5 small Midwest cities. The drugs were then driven to New York and from there distributed to major metropolitan areas.
These are the covers for where the stuff is coming in, and the Mafia still has a stranglehold on the business.
This is central Illinois farm country, hundreds of miles south of Chicago. Around here, once the corn is harvested and shipped out on Conrail, there's usually not that much to talk about until springtime. But this year, in the town of Paris, Illinois, there's a lot to talk about. The man everyone knows as Joe the Pizza Man, Giuseppe Vitale, who has lived here quietly with his family, has been identified by the FBI as a mafia mole from Italy, a man in the pizza business, but also in the heroin business, allegedly sent here to this remote farm town 11 years ago by his mafia bosses in Sicily. 2 hours away, in Olney, Illinois, another Joe the Pizza Man, Giuseppe Trupiano, who the FBI says is also a mafia mole, allegedly sent here to open a pizza parlor, raise a family, and blend in so that when orders came from Sicily, he could quietly slip away to help smuggle in huge shipments of heroin and then move the heroin to dealers in the big cities.
Now, Anthony Ruggiero grew up with John Gotti. He was in the Fulton Rockaway Boys gang with him in the 50s. They were catching cases together in the 60s, you know, stealing cars, stuff like that. And in 1973, Ruggiero was with Gotti when Gotti, well, they committed the crime together to really put them on the map with the old man Carlo Gambino and set Gotti up for his kind of golden boy status. They killed James McBratney, who had kidnapped Gambino, maybe Carlo Gambino's great nephew or something, and tried to hold him for ransom. They caught him in a bar and they murked him. And it should have been first-degree murder, but, you know, that was back when the mob had a hold on the court system, so Gotti and Ruggiero got a relatively short amount of time for manslaughter. They get out in maybe, they went in 73, they get out in the late 70s, they get made into the family. Gotti pretty rapidly becomes a capo, and Anthony Ruggiero's brother, Salvatore Ruggiero, who, as opposed to his Anthony, Gotti's best friend, being nicknamed Quack Quack because he talked so much, his brother Salvatore is nicknamed the Sphinx because he didn't talk a lot. And whether he was a made member or not is unclear because he was heavy in the drug dealing, and in the 80s he became a millionaire. It was often smarter for guys to not really get made so that they weren't subject to certain restrictions. They would still kick up money and be able to take advantage of certain, you know, the Mafia's hooks into corrupt police and judges and etc. and different networking opportunities. And so anyways, Salvatore Ruggiero was part of the pizza connection. He had a Sicilian connection, and so Gene Gotti, as you saw, along with Anthony Ruggiero, get indicted. Now, the way they got indicted goes back to this guy, Willie Boy Johnson, the part Native American who flipped and turned against the guys down at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club. And Willie Boy Johnson, a cautionary tale of what can happen to you when you become state's evidence, and the prosecutor's office is either compromised or not competent because they let it slip at a court proceeding that he was an informant and he ended up getting killed. But early in about 1981, his information led to Quack Quack Ruggiero's house being bugged.
The FBI gathered most of its evidence against the ring by two methods. First, they had an informant who penetrated the ring. And second, they planted bugs in this house in Cedarhurst.
So Quack Quack, who thinks his home line under his daughter's name is secure, is talking about all kind of stuff, including the H Almighty. And this leads to the indictment of him and Gene Gotti and others in 83. Now, there were two mistrials. So just like Gotti, the Teflon Don, it took them 4 times to get Gotti.
The government today lost one of its biggest organized crime cases when reputed Mafia boss John Gotti was acquitted in Brooklyn federal court. The jury, unnamed and sequestered to protect them from interference, deliberated for a week before returning unanimous not guilty verdicts against Gotti and 6 co-defendants.
Gene Gotti and Anthony Ruggiero had 2 times, or it took them 3 times, but it was in all those cases almost always because they were getting to jurors, and if you bribe one juror to hold out, you get a mistrial. So really what protected the Mafia all at their peak was they had such tentacles. They had even subverted, if they couldn't bribe the judge, they would get to a juror. That's what was keeping these guys out of prison. The feds were making good cases on them. Now, Quack Quack Ruggiero, who fell out of favor with John Gotti during this mid-80s time. Well, first of all, Quack Quack Ruggiero and John Carniglia, who was another guy in this conspiracy case with Gene Gotti and Gene Gotti as well were, Sammy the Bull claims they were all trigger men. They were part of the hit squad on Paul Castellano. Well, they needed to be because they were the ones who were going to get iced for dealing H, probably eventually under Big Paulie's orders. So that takeover of the Gambino family was a defensive move, really, by Gotti and his crew. You know, his brothers, Peter and Gene, and his old friend from growing up, the Fulton Rockaway boys, Anthony Ruggiero Sr., they were all subject, and maybe Gotti eventually, if it was shown he knew what was going on, to suffering the edict against heroin dealing, which again was selectively enforced, but it was enforced sometimes, and Paul Castellano was probably one of the ones that eventually may have enforced it. Now, Castellano at the time was about to be, or was under indictment in the commission case, or he was part of the commission case that ended up sending people like Tony Ducks and Fat Anthony Salerno to prison for 100 years. And one of the murders brought into that case was the Carmen Galante case. So again, heroin is always at the center of what these guys are doing because it just generated so much money. And when you're the people manufacturing it from the raw opium and you have access to bring it to New York and give it to people like Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas and many others, or Eddie Jackson in Detroit, and have it, you know, sold on the street, and you're really getting, you know, everyone's making a whole lot of money. So that's why it's so attractive. The Pizza Connection case was billions and billions of dollars. We know from watching Cocaine Cowboys that the skyline of Miami and Bogota, Colombia was built up with cocaine money. Well, in the late 70s, right at that same time, and really even before that, starting in the early to mid 70s, Palermo, the capital of Sicily, had the same phenomenon going up. The banks there were overflowing with money, and there was new construction everywhere. That was the money that was coming off the streets of Harlem and Chicago and Philly and Newark and D.C. and Detroit and going into the coffers of the Italian Mafia. So Anthony Ruggiero's house is bugged due to Willie Boy Johnson putting a bug in the Fed's ear that, you know, the layout of his house and that they should bug his house, and this leads to their indictment. But Anthony Ruggiero, ironically, John Gotti, you know, guys hold themselves at different standards than others. Ruggiero had probably helped Gotti kidnap his neighbor who had accidentally run over his son and killed him on the bike, which was a tragedy. So this is how close Ruggiero was to Gotti. When it came out about those tapes in the trial, Gotti kind of shelved Ruggiero. Ruggiero had, and then his age, I think it was about 49, he got, ended up being fatal lung cancer from all his smoking. And in his last dying days, his own brother, Gene Gotti, Sammy the Bull Gravano, was trying to tell John Gotti, hey, go say goodbye to him. This guy was your childhood friend. You came up with him. You caught your first cases together. You killed McBratney, which has got you on the fast track with Carlo Gambino, but he wouldn't do it. And he felt that Ruggiero had messed up so bad getting caught on the wiretaps. And of course, famously, John Gotti's voice was all over the place at his final trial. And Sammy the Bull Gravano, in fact, justifies his decision to become a informant to turn against with the fact that John Gotti sank them all. And Sammy the Bull also makes the claim that Gotti wanted him to take the fall and said, hey, everyone else is supposed to take the fall for the boss. Sort of true. Ironically, his own brother, Gene Gotti, and Carneglia, who both are they just recently got out of prison. They were in prison from 89 until 2018. They got 50 years for that heroin conspiracy from that news thing in the beginning. They just got out. They could have took pleas to 10 or 15 years back, and that the laws are just changing. And if they would have took 15-year pleas, they probably would have done 7 years. But Gotti had that kamikaze, fake, old school, oh no, we don't plead guilty to nothing, we always go to trial. And when I say they could have pled guilty, I don't mean they, like, obviously not turn state's evidence, just plead guilty. Gotti wouldn't let them. So they got 50 years. Those guys just now got out. Well, 2018 or something. They just got out. Carneglia and Gene Gotti, who were probably both triggermen in the Paul Castellano hit. So the iconic Spark Steakhouse rub out, John Gotti's rise to power. It was all about H. It was about dealing dope. Because even though the business of sticking a needle in your arm is not very glamorous, hey, the nuts and bolts of crime in America, of big money, is not glamorous. Gambling, degenerate gamblers who lose money and got to get beat up, so they hand over their mortgage payment so that their wife and kids lose their place to live because they are sick and they want to bet on the Super Bowl. You know, none of it's glamorous. They don't like to talk about the heroin stuff. Some of them definitely avoided heroin, but very few. The Bonanno family, Joe Bonanno was on 60 Minutes. Saw Karen, called his book A Man of Honor and all that. It was his underboss who then became boss of the Bonanno family, Carmine Galante Lilo, who was one of the most hardcore heroin kingpins of all time. And the other mobsters knocked him off because they didn't want him in 79 at Joe and Mary's lunch, because they didn't want him getting a final, or didn't want him getting a monopoly on the business because it was too lucrative. So John Gotti himself, not a known age dealer, but he was protecting his crew who was kicking up to him. Because they got caught up in that case. They were able to get several mistrials through bribing jurors, just like John Gotti did. But in the end, they got slammed because Gotti didn't let them plead guilty and take a 10 or 15-year plea. They got Gene and Carneglia, who helped them knock off Castellano. 50 years. They ended up doing 30, damn near. And Anthony Quack Quack Ruggiero, who did run his mouth too much. But the bug was placed in his house because of Willie Boy Johnson didn't like him, who was a snitch who got killed. And Ruggiero was a loyal friend to John, even though he was incompetent. You know, they caught their first cases together. They did the murder of Carlo, the guy that kidnapped Carlo Gambino's nephew, to get themselves on the board. As far as, kind of that fast tracking under Carlo Gambino. And they did, Ruggiero was possibly going to be underboss at one time. Like when Gotti first got in, that's how close they were. And then just that fast, he becomes persona non grata because the tapes come out, and his incompetence is too overwhelming, and he doesn't even go visit him when he's dying of cancer. So he had fun from, Gotti got out from his prison term in 77 or something, 76. No, from about 76 to 89 or so. Probably being John Gotti and Gene Gotti and Peter Carneglia and Anthony Ruggiero was probably pretty damn fun, but it's a Faustian bargain. It's a Faustian bargain. And if you don't know what that means, Goethe, the greatest German writer, who wrote a book, Dr. Faustus, and that's where the actual idea of a bargain with the devil, Mephistopheles. So you see any like the movie Sinners, you sell your soul to the devil so you can play the guitar. Well, that's it comes from Goethe, 17th century German writer. Dr. Faustus sells his soul to Mephistopheles in exchange for earthly pleasures. But anyways, hardcore being a serious criminal. Listen, if you're poor and you ain't got opportunities, I always say, and you need to go beat the streets and make some money, do it. But be smart. Don't waste your money. If you're risking your life and your freedom for money, be very cheap with your money. Whatever you're trying to buy with that money you earn, risking your life for freedom. One thing about America, whatever you're trying to buy today is for sale tomorrow. That bitch you want, it's going to be another version of her 2 years from now. Don't worry. Trust me. Don't worry. There'll always be a new car. You can always spend your money. You don't miss out on nothing by not buying it. It will always be available. Something better. This country, if nothing else, is a big store. So if you got to beat the street, please save your money and get up out them streets. Because playing the game at a high level has serious consequences. And this was a story, the true story of how heroin led John Gotti to bump off Paul Castellano and got his brother 50 years. Best friend died. He wouldn't talk to him because of the bugs of lung cancer, because of the heroin conspiracy. Carmen Galante had a couple-year run when he got out of prison as the heroin king, and they killed him because he was making too much money. No business like blow business, especially for the guineas. How profit America do.